Picture this. A young woman, desperate for a better life, sets her sights on an aging billionaire. But as she weaves her web of seduction, she uncovers dark secrets that will shake her to her core. In a world where nothing is as it seems, where love and greed collide, and where redemption comes at a devastating price, one question remains. How far would you go for a chance at a new life? Prepare to be captivated by a tale of ambition, betrayal, and unexpected bonds that will leave you questioning the very nature of right and wrong. On a crisp autumn evening in New York City, the annual Blackwood Foundation Charity Gala was in full swing. The city's elite had gathered at the opulent Rosewood Hotel, their designer gowns and tailored suits a testament to their wealth and status. Among them, a strikingly beautiful young woman named Amber Johnson stood out from the crowd. At 25 years old, Amber was a vision in a form-fitting emerald green dress that accentuated her curves and complemented her fiery red hair. Her green eyes sparkled with intelligence and determination as they scanned the room, searching for one particular guest. Amber's presence at the gala was no coincidence. For months, she had meticulously planned this moment, researching every detail about her target. Harold Blackwood, the 83-year-old real estate magnate worth billions. Tonight was the culmination of her efforts, the first step in a carefully crafted plan to secure her financial future. As she gracefully navigated through the crowd, Amber's mind raced with the information she had gathered. Harold Blackwood, widowed for over a decade, was known for his shrewdness in business, but also for his loneliness. His children and grandchildren rarely visited, too caught up in their own lives to care for the aging patriarch. It was a vulnerability Amber intended to exploit. Spotting her quarry near the bar, Amber took a deep breath and put on her most dazzling smile. She approached the bar, positioning herself close to Harold but not directly next to him. With practiced nonchalance, she ordered a glass of champagne. "Excuse me," she said softly, her voice lilting with a hint of apology. "Would you mind passing me that napkin?" Harold Blackwood turned, his steely blue eyes meeting Amber's green ones. For a moment, Amber saw a flicker of surprise in the old man's gaze, quickly replaced by a warm smile. "Of course, my dear," Harold replied, his voice surprisingly strong for his age. He handed her the napkin, his fingers brushing against hers for a fraction longer than necessary. "Thank you so much," Amber said, flashing him a grateful smile. "I'm Amber, by the way, Amber Johnson." "Harold Blackwood," he responded, extending his hand. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Amber." As they shook hands, Amber marveled at the strength in Harold's grip. Despite his advanced age, there was still a vitality about him that she hadn't expected. "Mr. Blackwood, it's an honor," Amber gushed, her eyes wide with feigned awe. "I've heard so much about your philanthropic work. The Blackwood Foundation has done incredible things for education in underprivileged communities." Harold's eyes lit up at the mention of his foundation. "You're familiar with our work?" "Oh yes," Amber nodded enthusiastically. "I've always been passionate about education. In fact, I volunteer at an after-school program in the Bronx. The impact of foundations like yours is truly inspiring." It wasn't entirely a lie. Amber had indeed volunteered at such a program, albeit briefly and solely for the purpose of having something to talk about with Harold. The old man, however, seemed genuinely impressed. "That's wonderful, my dear," Harold said, his voice warm with approval. "It's refreshing to see young people taking an interest in giving back to their communities." As they continued to chat, Amber carefully steered the conversation towards Harold's interests and experiences. She listened attentively as he spoke about his business ventures and his late wife, offering sympathetic nods and asking thoughtful questions at just the right moments. Throughout their conversation, Amber made sure to maintain subtle physical contact. A light touch on the arm here, a gentle pat on the hand there. She laughed at his jokes, her eyes twinkling with admiration, and leaned in close as if hanging on his every word. As the evening wore on, Amber could see her plan taking effect. Harold seemed to grow more animated, his posture straightening as he basked in the attention of this beautiful young woman. When he asked about her background, Amber was ready with her carefully crafted story. "I come from a small town in Ohio," she explained, a wistful look in her eyes. "My parents worked hard but struggled to make ends meet. I put myself through college with scholarships and part-time jobs. Now, I'm trying to build a life here in New York, but it's not easy." Harold nodded sympathetically. The city can be unforgiving, especially for a young person starting out. "What field are you in, my dear?" "I'm in marketing," Amber replied. "I have big dreams, but sometimes it feels like I'm just treading water. Still, I'm determined to make something of myself." As she spoke, Amber noticed a spark of interest in Harold's eyes. She had presented herself as the perfect combination. A hardworking, ambitious young woman with a heart of gold, struggling against the odds. It was an image designed to appeal to Harold's sense of paternalism and his desire to be needed. Just then, one of the event organizers approached Harold, reminding him that he was due to give a speech in a few minutes. "Oh, is it that time already?" Harold said, looking genuinely disappointed. He turned to Amber with a smile. "I'm sorry, my dear, but duty calls. It's been an absolute pleasure talking with you." Amber's heart raced. This was the moment she had been waiting for. "The pleasure was all mine, Mr. Blackwood," she said, her voice tinged with just the right amount of regret. "I've enjoyed our conversation so much." Harold hesitated for a moment, then reached into his pocket and pulled out a business card. "Here," he said, pressing it into her hand. "If you ever need any advice or just want to continue our chat, please don't hesitate to call my office." Amber's fingers closed around the card, her touch lingering on Harold's hand. "Thank you," she said softly, looking up at him through her lashes. "That means more than you know." As Harold walked away to prepare for his speech, Amber allowed herself a small, triumphant smile. Phase 1 of her plan had been executed flawlessly. She had made an impression on Harold Blackwood, planting the seeds of interest and intrigue. Watching him take the stage, Amber felt a twinge of something unexpected, a hint of guilt. Perhaps, she quickly pushed the feeling aside. This was business, she reminded herself. Harold Blackwood was her ticket to the life she had always dreamed of, and she couldn't afford to let emotions get in the way. As the applause for Harold's speech filled the ballroom, Amber slipped out of the gala, her mind already racing with plans for their next chance encounter. The game was on, and Amber Johnson was playing to win. 2 weeks had passed since the Blackwood Foundation Charity Gala, and Amber found herself sitting across from Harold Blackwood in an upscale Manhattan restaurant. The soft lighting cast a warm glow on Harold's weathered face, accentuating the twinkle in his blue eyes as he regaled her with stories from his youth. "You know, Amber," Harold chuckled, swirling his glass of scotch, "I wasn't always this respectable old man you see before you. In my college days, I was quite the rabble-rouser." Amber leaned forward, her emerald eyes wide with genuine interest. "Really? I can't imagine you causing trouble, Harold. Do tell." As Harold launched into a tale about sneaking into the dean's office to change his grades, Amber found herself laughing. Not the polite, calculated laugh she had practiced, but a real, hearty laugh that surprised even her. Over the past fortnight, she had orchestrated several chance meetings with Harold, each one carefully planned to deepen their connection. But something unexpected was happening. Harold Blackwood was turning out to be far more than the frail, lonely old man she had anticipated. He was sharp, witty, and full of fascinating stories. His mind was as keen as ever, and he had a way of seeing through pretense that both impressed and unnerved Amber. "You remind me of myself at your age," Harold said, his eyes twinkling with mischief. "Always looking for an angle, aren't you?" Amber felt a jolt of panic. Had he seen through her? But Harold's smile was warm, almost approving. She realized he was paying her a compliment, admiring what he perceived as her ambition. "I suppose I am," Amber admitted, deciding honesty might be the best approach. "Growing up with nothing, it makes you hungry for more." Harold nodded, his expression softening. "I understand that hunger, my dear, is what drove me to build my empire. But let me give you some advice. Don't let that hunger consume you. There are more important things in life than money. As Harold spoke, Amber felt a twinge of guilt. She had come into this with the sole intention of securing his fortune, but now she found herself genuinely enjoying his company and valuing his wisdom. Their conversation was interrupted by the buzzing of Harold's phone. He glanced at it and frowned. "Everything okay?" Amber asked, noting the sudden tension in his shoulders. Harold sighed, setting the phone aside. "It's my grandson, Tyler. He's in some kind of trouble again and needs money. The boy's talented, an artist, but he can't seem to get his act together." Amber saw an opportunity to deepen their connection. "That must be difficult for you," she said softly, reaching out to place her hand on Harold's. Wanting to help but not wanting to enable bad behavior. Harold looked at her with surprise and gratitude. "Exactly. It's a delicate balance. My late wife, Margaret, she always knew how to handle these situations. I'm afraid I'm not as adept." As Harold opened up about his family struggles, Amber listened attentively, offering sympathy and the occasional piece of advice. She learned about Tyler, the struggling artist grandson, Jessica, Harold's estranged daughter who had cut ties years ago, and Robert, the nephew who seemed more interested in Harold's money than his well-being. "I'm sorry, my dear," Harold said suddenly, looking embarrassed. "I didn't mean to burden you with all this family drama." "Not at all," Amber reassured him, surprised to find she meant it. "I'm honored that you trust me enough to share this with me." As they left the restaurant, Harold insisted on having his driver take Amber home. Standing on the sidewalk, waiting for the car, Harold turned to Amber with a serious expression. "Amber, I want you to know how much I've enjoyed our time together," he said, his voice gruff with emotion. "You've brought a light back into my life that I thought had gone out when Margaret passed." Amber felt a lump form in her throat. This wasn't part of the plan. She wasn't supposed to care about Harold's feelings, wasn't supposed to feel guilty about her intentions. "I've enjoyed our time too, Harold," she said softly, and was startled to realize she was telling the truth. As she settled into the back of Harold's luxurious town car, Amber's mind was in turmoil. She had set out to seduce a lonely old man for his money, but instead found herself forming a genuine connection with a complex, intelligent individual. The lines between her calculated plan and her true feelings were beginning to blur. Meanwhile, across town, in a dimly lit art studio, Tyler Blackwood stared at his grandfather's text message, declining his request for money. His eyes darted to the half-finished painting on his easel, a swirl of dark colors representing his inner turmoil. With a frustrated growl, he picked up his phone again, this time dialing a different number. "Robert, it's Tyler. We need to talk about Grandpa. I think there's someone new in the picture, and I don't like it one bit." As Tyler hung up the phone, he couldn't shake the feeling that things were about to get complicated. Little did he know, back in Harold's car, Amber was having similar thoughts, her carefully laid plans suddenly seeming far less certain than they had just hours before. The Blackwood Mansion, a sprawling estate on the outskirts of New York City, had stood silent for years. But on this crisp fall morning, the old house was buzzing with activity. Harold Blackwood stood at the grand window of his study, watching as a series of expensive cars pulled into the circular driveway. "They're here," he muttered, a mix of anticipation and dread in his voice. Amber, who had been arranging flowers on a nearby table, moved to stand beside him. Over the past month, she had become a constant presence in Harold's life, her role evolving into something between a companion and a personal assistant. "Are you sure you want to do this, Harold?" she asked, genuine concern in her voice. Harold turned to her, his blue eyes filled with determination. "It's time, my dear. I can't keep avoiding my family forever." As they watched, the first to emerge from a sleek black SUV was Robert Blackwood, Harold's nephew. At 45, Robert exuded an air of entitlement, his designer suit and slicked-back hair screaming of old money and questionable morals. "Uncle Harold," Robert called out, his voice carrying across the manicured lawn. "It's been far too long." Harold's lips thinned into a tight smile. "Brace yourself, Amber," he whispered, The vultures are circling. Next to arrive was Tyler, Harold's grandson. The 28-year-old artist stumbled out of a beat-up taxi, his clothes splattered with paint and his hair a disheveled mess. He squinted up at the mansion as if seeing it for the first time, a mixture of awe and resentment on his face. "Who's that?" Amber asked, pointing to a sleek sports car that had just pulled up. Harold's expression softened slightly. "That would be my daughter, Jessica." A striking woman in her early 50s emerged from the car. Even from a distance, Amber could see the family resemblance. Jessica had Harold's piercing blue eyes and strong jawline, but there was a hardness to her features, a tension that spoke of years of estrangement. As the family members gathered on the front steps, casting curious glances at the mansion and each other, Harold took a deep breath. "Well, my dear," he said to Amber, "shall we go greet the prodigal family?" Amber nodded, suddenly feeling like an intruder in this family drama. As they made their way downstairs, she could hear raised voices from the foyer. "Can't believe you called us all here after years of radio silence," Jessica was saying, her voice sharp with accusation. Now, cousin," Robert interjected smoothly. "I'm sure Uncle Harold has his reasons. We should hear him out before we start throwing accusations around." Tyler, who had been silently taking in the opulent surroundings, finally spoke up. "Yeah, like why he's been ignoring my calls for months, but suddenly wants a family reunion." The bickering ceased abruptly as Harold and Amber entered the foyer. For a moment, all eyes were on them, a mixture of surprise, curiosity, and in some cases, barely concealed hostility. "Welcome, all of you," Harold said, his voice strong and commanding despite his age. "It's good to see you. I know it's been a long time, and we have much to discuss. But first, allow me to introduce Amber Johnson, my friend and assistant." Amber felt the weight of their stares, each family member sizing her up in their own way. Robert's eyes gleamed with calculation, Jessica's narrowed with suspicion, and Tyler's widened with a hint of attraction. "A friend, uncle?" Robert said, his tone dripping with insinuation. "How interesting." Jessica stepped forward, her gaze never leaving Amber. "And how long has this friendship been going on, father?" Harold's jaw tightened, but before he could respond, Tyler chimed in. "Hey, lay off, Mom. If Gramps has found someone who makes him happy, good for him. Lord knows he's been alone long enough." Amber felt a rush of gratitude towards Tyler, even as she registered the complex dynamics at play. She could see the greed in Robert's eyes, the hurt and anger in Jessica's, and the mix of resentment and admiration in Tyler's. "Perhaps we should all move to the living room," Amber suggested, hoping to diffuse the tension. "I'm sure you all have a lot to catch up on." As they moved into the spacious living room, Amber couldn't help but notice how out of place they all looked among the antique furniture and priceless art. These people might be Harold's family by blood, but they were strangers in his home. Harold took a seat in his favorite armchair, gesturing for the others to make themselves comfortable. "I'm sure you're all wondering why I've called you here," he began. "Let me guess," Jessica interrupted, her voice cold. "You're dying and want to sort out your will?" Harold's eyes flashed with a mixture of hurt and anger. "No, Jessica, I'm not dying. At least, not any faster than usual at my age. I called you here because I've realized that life is too short for estrangement and petty grievances. I want to reconnect with my family." Robert leaned forward, a practiced look of concern on his face. "That's wonderful, Uncle. We've all missed you terribly, haven't we?" He glanced meaningfully at Jessica and Tyler. Tyler, who had been examining a nearby sculpture with an artist's eye, looked up. "Yeah, sure. Missed you, Gramps. So, does this reconnecting come with any perks? Like, say, helping out your struggling artist grandson?" Amber watched as Harold's expression cycled through disappointment, resignation, and finally, determination. She could see that despite their flaws, he truly cared for these people. "I propose we spend the next few weeks here together," Harold said, "to get to know each other again, to heal old wounds and forge new bonds. And yes, Tyler, to discuss how I might be able to help each of you within reason." The reaction was immediate. Robert's eyes lit up with barely concealed greed, Jessica's posture stiffened with reluctance, and Tyler's face split into a hopeful grin. As the family began to discuss logistics and air-old grievances, Amber found herself fading into the background. She observed the dynamics at play, noting the alliances forming and the tensions simmering beneath the surface. Harold caught her eye across the room, giving her a weary but grateful smile. In that moment, Amber realized that her role in this household had just become far more complicated. She was no longer just trying to win Harold's affection. She was now a player in a complex family drama, with millions of dollars and decades of history at stake. As the sun began to set outside, casting long shadows across the Blackwood estate, Amber couldn't shake the feeling that the real games were just beginning. And she, the outsider with her own hidden agenda, was right in the middle of it all. A week had passed since the Blackwood family's reunion, and the mansion buzzed with a tense energy. Amber found herself navigating a minefield of family dynamics, all while trying to maintain her closeness to Harold. On this particular evening, she was in Harold's study, organizing some old files at his request. "Amber, my dear," Harold called from his armchair, where he was poring over some documents. "Could you fetch the Peterson file from the safe? The combination is December 24th, 36. Amber nodded, moving towards the imposing safe hidden behind a painting of the New York skyline. As she input the combination, she couldn't help but feel a thrill of excitement. This was the first time Harold had trusted her with access to his most private documents. The safe door swung open with a soft click. Amber's eyes scanned the neatly labeled folders until she found the one marked Peterson. As she reached for it, her elbow knocked against a stack of papers, sending them cascading to the floor. "Oh, I'm so sorry, Harold," she exclaimed, quickly kneeling to gather the scattered documents. "No harm done, my dear," Harold replied, not looking up from his work. "Just be careful with those old papers. Some of them are quite sensitive." As Amber collected the fallen documents, her eyes caught a glimpse of a headline on one of the yellowed newspaper clippings. "Mysterious fire destroys rival company, Blackwood Enterprises acquires assets." Intrigued, Amber couldn't help but read further. The article detailed a suspicious fire that had destroyed the main factory of Blackwood's biggest competitor in 1975. The timing had been remarkably convenient for Blackwood Enterprises, allowing Harold to acquire the rival company's assets at a fraction of their worth. Amber's heart began to race. Could Harold have been involved in something so unethical, possibly even criminal? She quickly stuffed the clipping back into its folder, her mind reeling. As she stood up, another document caught her eye. It was a legal agreement dated just a few years after the fire. Amber's eyes widened as she scanned its contents. It appeared to be a settlement between Blackwood Enterprises and a former employee named Frank Doherty, who had threatened to go public with information about the company's questionable business practices. The settlement amount was staggering, and a non-disclosure agreement was included. At the bottom of the page, Harold's signature stood out in bold, authoritative strokes. "Amber, is everything all right?" Harold's voice snapped her back to reality. She quickly shoved the documents back into the safe, her hands trembling slightly. "Yes, just fine," she called back, trying to keep her voice steady. "Just dropped a few things." As she returned to Harold with the Peterson file, Amber's mind was in turmoil. The man sitting before her, the kind and wise mentor she had grown to genuinely care for, suddenly seemed like a stranger. How could the Harold she knew be the same person who had potentially orchestrated the destruction of a rival company and silenced whistleblowers? "Thank you, my dear," Harold said, smiling up at her as he took the file. His blue eyes, usually so warm and inviting, now seemed to hold hidden depths that Amber found unsettling. For the rest of the evening, Amber found it difficult to concentrate. She went through the motions of her usual tasks, all while her mind raced with questions and doubts. The moral dilemma she now faced was far more complex than she had ever anticipated when she first set out to seduce Harold for his fortune. As she prepared to leave for the night, Harold called out to her. "Amber, is everything all right?" You seem distracted this evening. Amber forced a smile. Just tired, I suppose. It's been a long week with the family here. Harold nodded sympathetically. Indeed it has. They can be challenging. I'm grateful to have you here, Amber. You've become a true friend to me. The sincerity in his voice made Amber's chest tighten with guilt and confusion. How could she reconcile the Harold she had come to know with the ruthless businessman suggested by those documents? As she drove home that night, Amber found herself at a crossroads. She had entered into the situation with the intention of manipulating Harold for his money. Now, she found herself genuinely caring for him, only to discover that he might be hiding a dark past. What should she do with this information? Confront Harold? Use it as leverage? Or pretend she had never seen those damning documents? The city lights blurred as tears filled Amber's eyes. She had come to New York with dreams of wealth and success, willing to do whatever it took to achieve them. But now, faced with the reality of Harold's potential misdeeds and her own growing feelings for him, she realized that the path ahead was far more complicated than she had ever imagined. As she pulled into her apartment complex, Amber made a decision. She needed to know more before she could decide her next move. Tomorrow, she would start digging deeper into Harold Blackwood's past, no matter where it might lead her. Little did she know, her actions in the study had not gone entirely unnoticed. From the shadows of the hallway, Tyler Blackwood had observed Amber's reaction to the documents in the safe. His artist's eye had caught the subtle changes in her demeanor, the tension in her shoulders as she replaced the papers. As he retreated to his room, Tyler couldn't help but wonder what secrets his grandfather was hiding, and what role this intriguing young woman played in it all. The Blackwood family drama was about to get a lot more complicated. The Blackwood mansion had become a powder keg of tension, and Amber found herself at the center of it all. 2 weeks had passed since her discovery in Harold's study, and the weight of that knowledge pressed heavily upon her. On this particular morning, Amber sat at the breakfast table, surrounded by the Blackwood family. The air was thick with unspoken hostilities and barely concealed agendas. "So, Amber," Robert began, his voice dripping with false sweetness, "how exactly did you and Uncle Harold meet? It must be quite a story." Amber felt all eyes turn to her. She cleared her throat, acutely aware of Harold's gaze. "We met at a charity gala," she replied, sticking as close to the truth as possible. "We got to talking about education initiatives, and well, one thing led to another." Jessica snorted derisively. "I'm sure it did," she muttered under her breath. Harold's hand clenched around his coffee cup. "That's enough, Jessica. Amber has been nothing but kind and helpful since she came into my life." "Oh, I'm sure she has," Jessica retorted, her eyes flashing. "I'm just wondering what's in it for her." Before Amber could respond, Tyler unexpectedly came to her defense. "Lay off, Mom. Amber's cool. She's been helping me with some ideas for my art." Amber shot Tyler a grateful look, but she couldn't shake the feeling that his support came with strings attached. Over the past 2 weeks, she had noticed him watching her closely, his artist's eye seeming to pick up on every subtle reaction and gesture. As the tense breakfast continued, Amber's mind wandered to the investigation she had been conducting in secret. Late at night, after everyone had gone to bed, she had been scouring online archives and making discreet phone calls, trying to uncover more about the mysterious fire and the silenced whistleblower. What she had found both fascinated and terrified her. There were whispers of corporate espionage, of rival executives who had disappeared under mysterious circumstances. The more she dug, the more she realized that Harold Blackwood's empire was built on a foundation far shakier than she had ever imagined. "Earth to Amber," Robert's voice cut through her thoughts. "I was asking if you'd like to join me for a walk in the gardens. I'd love to get to know my uncle's friend better." Amber hesitated, glancing at Harold. His face was impassive, but she could see a flicker of concern in his eyes. "That sounds lovely, Robert," she replied, forcing a smile. "But I'm afraid I have some work to catch up on this morning. Perhaps another time." Robert's eyes narrowed slightly, but his smile remained fixed. Of course, Work comes first, doesn't it? As the family dispersed after breakfast, Amber felt a hand on her arm. She turned to find Tyler looking at her intently. "Hey," he said, his voice low. "Can we talk? In private?" Amber nodded, her heart racing. Had Tyler noticed something? Did he suspect her of digging into Harold's past? They made their way to Tyler's makeshift art studio in one of the mansion's spare rooms. Canvases covered in swirls of dark, brooding colors lined the walls. "What's on your mind, Tyler?" Amber asked, trying to keep her voice steady. Tyler ran a hand through his disheveled hair. "Look, I know you're not just some gold digger after Gramps' money. I've seen the way you look at him, the way you actually listen when he talks." Amber felt a pang of guilt at Tyler's words. If only he knew the truth about how this had all started. "But," Tyler continued, his eyes boring into hers, "I also know you're hiding something. I saw you in Gramps' study the other night. You found something in that safe, didn't you?" Amber's breath caught in her throat. She opened her mouth to deny it, but Tyler held up a hand. "I'm not here to judge or threaten you," he said. "I just want to know the truth. About you, about Gramps, about this whole messed up family." For a moment, Amber considered coming clean, telling Tyler everything. But the stakes were too high, the web too tangled. "Tyler," she said carefully, "your grandfather is a complex man with a complicated past. That's all I can say." Tyler studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Fair enough, but just know I'm watching. And if you hurt him, if this is all some kind of con—" "It's not," Amber interrupted, surprised by the vehemence in her own voice. "Whatever else you might think of me, know that I care about your grandfather." As she left Tyler's studio, Amber's mind was reeling. The lines between her original plan and her genuine feelings for Harold were blurring more each day. And now, with Tyler's suspicions and the family's growing hostility, she felt like she was walking a tightrope without a safety net. Meanwhile, in his study, Harold Blackwood sat behind his massive oak desk, staring at an old photograph. It showed a younger version of himself standing next to Frank Doherty, the whistleblower he had silenced years ago. Harold's finger traced the outline of Doherty's face. "Oh, Frank," he murmured, "if only you had kept your mouth shut. If only I had made a different choice." He glanced up at the door, thinking of Amber. For the first time in years, he had allowed someone to get close to him. But could he trust her with the darkest chapters of his past? As the clock on the mantel chimed the hour, Harold made a decision. It was time to come clean, to lay all his cards on the table. But first, he needed to be sure of Amber's true intentions. Little did he know, forces were already in motion that would bring all the carefully guarded secrets of the Blackwood family crashing into the light. The Blackwood mansion was shrouded in an eerie quiet as dawn broke over the expansive grounds. Amber stirred from a fitful sleep, her dreams haunted by the secrets she'd uncovered and the moral quandary she found herself in. As she made her way downstairs, the silence was suddenly shattered by a loud crash and a muffled cry. "Harold!" she gasped, recognizing the voice immediately. Amber raced towards Harold's study, her heart pounding. She found him crumpled on the floor, his face ashen and contorted in pain. "Harold! Oh my God, Harold!" she cried, kneeling beside him. "What happened? Can you hear me?" Harold's eyes fluttered open, unfocused and filled with pain. "Amber," he whispered weakly. "My chest can't breathe." Without hesitation, Amber pulled out her phone and dialed 911. As she relayed the situation to the dispatcher, the commotion drew the attention of the other family members. Jessica burst into the room first, her eyes widening at the sight of her father on the floor. "Dad, what did you do to him?" she accused, glaring at Amber. "I didn't do anything," Amber shot back, her voice shaking. "I found him like this. The ambulance is on its way." Robert appeared in the doorway, his usual smooth demeanor cracking at the edges. "Uncle Harold," he murmured, for once seeming genuinely concerned. Tyler pushed past his uncle, dropping to his knees beside Amber. "Gramps, hang in there," he said, gripping Harold's hand. "Help is coming." The next few hours passed in a blur of sirens, rushed explanations to paramedics, and a tense ride to the hospital. Amber found herself in the waiting room with the Blackwood family, the air thick with worry and unspoken accusations. "Family of Harold Blackwood?" a doctor called out, approaching the group. They all stood, a united front for perhaps the first time since their reunion. "Mr. Blackwood has suffered a minor heart attack," the doctor explained. "We've stabilized him, but he'll need to stay in the hospital for observation and further tests." A collective sigh of relief rippled through the group, quickly followed by a barrage of questions. "Can we see him?" Jessica demanded. "Is he going to be okay?" Tyler asked, his artistic bravado stripped away to reveal genuine concern. "What caused this?" Robert inquired, his mind already racing with the implications. The doctor held up a hand to stem the tide of questions. "He's resting now. You can see him briefly, one at a time. As for the cause, stress seems to be a significant factor. Has Mr. Blackwood been under any unusual pressure lately?" The family members exchanged glances, each aware of the tension that had been building in the mansion over the past weeks. As the others argued over who should see Harold first, Amber slipped away, finding a quiet corner of the waiting room. She pulled out her phone, her finger hovering over a number she had discovered in her investigations. Frank Doherty, the former employee who had been silenced years ago. Amber's hand trembled as she contemplated making the call. With Harold incapacitated, this might be her best chance to get to the truth. But was it worth potentially worsening Harold's condition if he found out? Before she could decide, a hand fell on her shoulder. She looked up to see Tyler, his eyes red-rimmed and tired. "Hey," he said softly, "Gramps is asking for you." Amber's heart leapt into her throat. "Me? But what about Jessica or Robert?" Tyler shrugged. "He was pretty insistent. Said he needed to talk to you about something important." As Amber made her way to Harold's room, she could feel the burning glares of Jessica and Robert on her back. She steeled herself, knowing that whatever Harold had to say could change everything. She entered the hospital room, her breath catching at the sight of Harold looking so frail and vulnerable, hooked up to various machines. His eyes, however, were as sharp and clear as ever. "Amber, my dear," he said, his voice weak but determined. "We need to talk. There are things you need to know. About me, about the company, about everything." Amber took his hand, her heart racing. "Harold, you should rest. We can talk later." Harold shook his head stubbornly. "No, it has to be now. I've carried these secrets for too long, and they're eating me alive. You deserve to know the truth, all of it." As Harold began to speak, Amber listened with growing horror and fascination. The story he told was one of ambition, ruthlessness, and regret. A tale that painted a picture of a man far more complex than she had ever imagined. Outside the room, unbeknownst to either of them, Tyler leaned against the wall, straining to hear snippets of the conversation. His artist's mind was already painting scenarios, wondering how this revelation would change the family dynamics and his own plans. Meanwhile, in the hospital parking lot, Robert sat in his car, phone in hand. "Listen," he hissed into the device. "Things have changed. We need to move up our timeline. If the old man spills everything to that girl, we're done for." As night fell over the city, the Blackwood family found themselves at a crossroads. Harold's health crisis had brought long-buried secrets to the surface, and the fragile alliances within the family were about to be tested like never before. Amber, caught in the middle of it all, realized that her own moral compass would be the key to navigating the stormy waters ahead. As she left Harold's room, his secrets weighing heavily on her conscience, she knew that the choices she made in the coming days would not only determine her own fate, but potentially the future of the entire Blackwood empire. The sterile hospital corridor seemed to stretch endlessly as Amber paced back and forth, her mind reeling from Harold's confession. The weight of his secrets pressed down on her, making each step feel like a monumental effort. She barely noticed when Tyler approached, his face a mask of concern and curiosity. "Amber, what did Gramps tell you?" Tyler asked, his voice low and urgent. She looked at him, unsure of how much to reveal. Tyler, It's complicated. Your grandfather has been through a lot, and he's made some difficult decisions. Tyler's eyes narrowed. Cut the crap, Amber. I heard enough to know it's big. Is it about the fire? The one that destroyed his competitor's factory. Amber's sharp intake of breath was all the confirmation Tyler needed. He ran a hand through his disheveled hair, his artistic temperament giving way to a shrewder side that Amber hadn't seen before. I always suspected there was more to that story, Tyler muttered. But Amber, you need to be careful. If what Gramps told you is what I think it is, there are people who would do anything to keep it quiet. As if on cue, Robert rounded the corner, his usual smooth demeanor slightly ruffled. Well, he said, his voice dripping with false congeniality. What are you two whispering about? Sharing family secrets, are we? Amber straightened, forcing her face into a neutral expression. Just discussing Harold's condition, Robert. Nothing more. Robert's eyes flickered between Amber and Tyler, clearly not believing a word. Of course, he said smoothly. Well, if you're done with your discussion, I'd like a word with you, Amber. In private. Tyler opened his mouth to protest, but Amber silenced him with a look. It's okay, Tyler. I'll catch up with you later. As Tyler reluctantly walked away, Robert led Amber to a secluded corner of the waiting room. His facade of friendliness dropped away, replaced by a cold, calculating stare. Listen carefully, Robert hissed, his voice barely above a whisper. I don't know what Uncle Harold told you, but if you breathe a word of it to anyone, you'll regret it. Do you understand? Amber felt a chill run down her spine, but she held her ground. Is that a threat, Robert? Robert's lips curled into a humorless smile. Consider it friendly advice. You're way out of your depth here, little girl. Whatever game you're playing, whatever angle you're working, it's time to cut your losses and walk away. Before Amber could respond, Jessica's voice cut through the tension. What's going on here? She demanded, approaching with suspicion in her eyes. Robert's demeanor changed instantly, his shark-like smile back in place. Just having a friendly chat with our dear Amber here. Isn't that right? Amber nodded stiffly, her mind racing. She knew she was in dangerous waters now, with Robert's threat hanging over her and Jessica's hostility palpable. As the day wore on, Amber found herself increasingly isolated. The Blackwood family closed ranks, their suspicions and rivalries temporarily set aside in the face of Harold's health crisis. She caught snippets of hushed conversations, saw meaningful glances exchanged, and felt the weight of unspoken accusations every time she entered a room. It was late in the evening when Amber's phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Meet me in the hospital parking garage, level B2. Come alone. FD. Her heart raced as she realized who it must be. Frank Doherty, the whistleblower Harold had mentioned in his confession. How had he found her? And more importantly, what did he want? Torn between curiosity and caution, Amber made her way to the parking garage. The fluorescent lights flickered ominously as she reached level B2, casting long shadows between the parked cars. Ms. Johnson, a gravelly voice called out. A figure stepped from behind a pillar, an older man with a weathered face and sharp eyes. I'm Frank Doherty. I believe we have a lot to talk about. As Amber approached, her instincts screaming at her to turn and run, she failed to notice the security camera in the corner. In the hospital security office, Tyler sat hunched over a monitor, his artist's eye taking in every detail of the clandestine meeting unfolding before him. Meanwhile, in Harold's hospital room, Robert stood by the window, phone pressed to his ear. It's happening, he murmured. The girl is meeting with Doherty. We need to move. Now. As the pieces of the Blackwood family drama began to fall into place, Amber found herself at the center of a web of lies, betrayals, and long-buried secrets. The choices she would make in the coming hours would not only determine her own fate, but potentially unravel the entire Blackwood empire. Little did she know, the true test of her character and her feelings for Harold was yet to come. The Blackwood mansion loomed before Amber, its imposing facade a stark contrast to the turmoil she felt within. It had been a week since Harold's heart attack, and his sudden recovery and discharge from the hospital had taken everyone by surprise. Now, as she climbed the steps to the main entrance, Amber couldn't shake the feeling that she was walking into the lion's den. The great oak doors swung open, revealing Harold standing in the foyer. Despite his recent health scare, he looked reinvigorated, his blue eyes sharp and alert. "Ah, Amber, my dear. Right on time," Harold said, his voice warm but tinged with an undercurrent of tension. "Everyone's gathered in the study. It's time we sorted this all out." Amber followed Harold, her mind racing. The clandestine meeting with Frank Doherty in the parking garage had yielded more questions than answers, and she still hadn't decided how much to reveal to Harold about it. As they entered the study, Amber was met with a tableau of barely contained hostility. Robert lounged in an armchair, his casual pose belied by the predatory gleam in his eyes. Jessica stood by the window, arms crossed, her face a mask of suspicion. Tyler perched on the edge of a desk, his artist's hands fidgeting nervously with a pencil. "Now that we're all here," Harold began, taking his seat behind the massive oak desk, "it's time I addressed the elephant in the room. My health scare has made me realize that life is too short for secrets and manipulations." He pulled out a thick envelope from his desk drawer. "This, my dear family, is my last will and testament. But before I reveal its contents, I want to make something clear. The past week has shown me who truly cares about me and who is merely after my money." Harold's gaze swept the room, lingering on each face. Amber felt her heart race as his eyes met hers, wondering what he had deduced about her true intentions. "So," Harold continued, "I've decided to add a codicil to my will. For the next month, all of you will live here in the mansion. During this time, you'll face a series of test challenges that will reveal your true characters." A chorus of protests erupted, but Harold silenced them with a raised hand. "This is non-negotiable," he said firmly. "At the end of the month, I will make my final decision on the distribution of my estate. And believe me, the results may surprise you all." Robert leaned forward, his smooth veneer cracking slightly. "Uncle Harold, surely this isn't necessary. We're family after all." "Are we, Robert?" Harold replied coolly. "Then you should have no problem proving it over the next month." Jessica's eyes narrowed. "And what about her?" she asked, jerking her head towards Amber. "She's not family. Why is she part of this experiment?" Harold's expression softened as he looked at Amber. "Amber has earned her place here. Whether she chooses to stay and participate is up to her." All eyes turned to Amber, the weight of their gazes almost palpable. She swallowed hard, knowing her next words could change everything. "I'll stay," she said quietly, meeting Harold's eyes. "Not for the money, but because I care about what happens to you, Harold." Tyler let out a low whistle. "Well, this just got interesting." For the next hour, Harold laid out the rules of his unusual testament. Each person would be given a suite in the mansion with access to common areas. They would face individual and group challenges, designed to test their ethics, compassion, and true motivations. As Harold spoke, Amber's mind whirled. She thought of Frank Doherty's warnings, of Robert's threats, of the secrets she now carried. How could she navigate this moral maze while protecting Harold and staying true to herself? "One last thing," Harold said as they prepared to leave. "There will be no outside communication during this month. No phones, no internet, no visitors. You'll find everything you need here in the mansion." As they filed out of the study, Amber felt a hand on her arm. She turned to find Tyler looking at her intently. "You and I need to talk," he whispered. "Meet me in the conservatory at midnight. There's something you need to know." Amber nodded, her pulse quickening. As she headed to her assigned suite, she couldn't help but feel that she had just stepped into an elaborate game, one where the stakes were far higher than mere money. In his study, Harold sank into his chair, suddenly looking every one of his 83 years. He pulled out an old photograph, the same one of him and Frank Doherty that he had been looking at the day of his heart attack. "Oh, Frank," he murmured, I hope I'm doing the right thing. It's time the truth came out, no matter the cost. As night fell over the Blackwood mansion, tension and anticipation hung in the air. For Amber and the Blackwood family, the next month would be a crucible, testing their morals, their loyalties, and the very foundations of who they believed themselves to be. Little did they know, forces beyond their control were already in motion, threatening to bring the entire Blackwood empire crashing down around them. 3 weeks had passed since Harold's enigmatic testament announcement, and the Blackwood mansion had become a pressure cooker of emotions, alliances, and betrayals. Amber found herself at the center of it all, navigating a minefield of moral dilemmas and unexpected revelations. As she made her way to the grand living room for what Harold had announced would be their final challenge, Amber's mind raced with everything that had transpired. The midnight meeting with Tyler in the conservatory had revealed shocking information about Robert's behind-the-scenes machinations. Jessica's initial hostility had given way to an uneasy alliance after they had been forced to work together on a particularly grueling challenge. And Harold remained an enigma, his piercing blue eyes seeming to see right through her every time they spoke. The living room was thick with tension as Amber entered. Robert lounged in an armchair, his usual smooth demeanor showing cracks of strain. Jessica paced by the window, her fingers nervously twisting a strand of pearls. Tyler sat cross-legged on the floor, sketching furiously in his notebook, his artistic outlet a clear sign of his anxiety. Harold entered last, leaning heavily on his cane but with a fire in his eyes that belied his frail appearance. "Well, my dear family, and Amber, we've come to the final test. But before we begin, I want to commend you all. These past weeks have revealed sides of you I never knew existed." He paused, his gaze sweeping the room. "However, they've also exposed long-buried secrets and resentments. It's time we brought everything into the light." With a nod to his butler, a large screen descended from the ceiling. "What you're about to see is footage from hidden cameras placed throughout the mansion. Each of you has been recorded in moments of privacy, making choices you thought no one would ever know about." A collective gasp filled the room. Amber felt her heart race, thinking of all the private conversations she'd had, the late-night phone call she'd managed to sneak to Frank Doherty. "We'll watch these recordings together," Harold continued, his voice grave. "And then each of you will have a choice to make. A choice that will determine not just your inheritance, but the very future of the Blackwood legacy." As the footage began to play, the room was filled with a cacophony of recorded voices and gasps of recognition. Amber watched, horrified, as her own face appeared on the screen, caught in a heated argument with Robert, where she revealed her knowledge of the company's darker past. But she wasn't the only one exposed. The recordings showed Robert in secret meetings with shady business associates, plotting to take control of the company. Jessica was seen making a tearful phone call, confessing her regret for years of estrangement from her father. And Tyler's footage showed him in the security room, watching everyone else's private moments, his artist's eye capturing every detail in his sketchbook. As the last recording faded to black, Harold stood, his face a mask of emotion. "Now you know. Now you've seen the truth about yourselves and each other. But knowledge is not enough. It's what you choose to do with it that matters." He gestured to a table that had been wheeled in, covered with a velvet cloth. With a flourish, he pulled the cloth away, revealing 4 red buttons. "Your final test is this," Harold said, his voice heavy with the weight of the moment. "Each of these buttons, if pressed, will transfer the entirety of my fortune and control of Blackwood Enterprises to the person who presses it. But, and this is crucial, it will also immediately alert the authorities to any and all illegal activities that person has been involved in, past or present." A stunned silence fell over the room. Amber's mind reeled with the implications. She thought of her own manipulations, of the secrets she now carried about Harold's past. "You have 1 hour to decide," Harold said, sinking into his chair. "Choose wisely, for this decision will not only determine your financial future, but will also reveal the true nature of your character." As a large clock on the wall began to tick down the seconds, Amber looked around at the Blackwood family. Robert's face was a mask of calculation. Clearly weighing the pros and cons, Jessica had gone pale, her hands shaking slightly. Tyler had stopped sketching, his eyes darting between the buttons and his grandfather. And Harold was looking directly at Amber, his gaze a mixture of challenge and something else. Hope, perhaps? In that moment, Amber realized that this final test was about more than money or power. It was about redemption, about facing the consequences of one's actions, about choosing integrity over personal gain. As the clock ticked relentlessly toward 0, Amber knew that the choice she made in the next hour would define not just her future, but the very essence of who she was. The true test of character had begun, and the stakes could not be higher. The ticking of the ornate grandfather clock echoed through the Blackwood Mansion's grand living room, each second amplifying the tension. Amber's eyes darted between the 4 red buttons on the table, her fellow contestants, and Harold, who sat watching them all with an unreadable expression. As the final minutes of the hour ticked away, the room was thick with unspoken thoughts and internal struggles. Robert paced near the buttons, his usual smooth demeanor cracked by indecision. Jessica sat rigidly in an armchair, her knuckles white as she gripped the armrests. Tyler had resumed his furious sketching, his pencil flying across the page as if trying to draw his way out of this moral labyrinth. Amber's mind raced. She thought of her initial plan to seduce Harold for his money, of the genuine affection that had grown between them, of the dark secrets she now carried about the Blackwood Empire. She thought of Frank Doherty's warnings and the web of lies and half-truths she'd become entangled in. With just 5 minutes left on the clock, Robert suddenly strode towards the buttons, his face set with determination. "I can't let this empire fall apart," he declared, his hand hovering over one of the red buttons. "Uncle Harold, I know I've made mistakes, but I'm the only one who can lead Blackwood Enterprises into the future." Just as his finger was about to make contact, Jessica leapt up. "Wait!" she cried. "Robert, think about what you're doing. Is it worth sacrificing your freedom?" Robert hesitated, conflict clear on his face. In that moment of distraction, Tyler sprang forward, his artist's agility surprising everyone. "I'm sorry, Gramps," he said, his hand reaching for a button. "But I need this. My art." "Stop!" Amber's voice cut through the chaos. All eyes turned to her as she stepped forward, placing herself between the family and the buttons. "Don't you see what's happening here?" she said, her voice trembling but growing stronger with each word. "This isn't about the money or the company. It's about the truth. It's about facing who we really are and the choices we've made." She turned to Harold, tears glistening in her eyes. "Harold, I came here with the intention of seducing you for your money. But somewhere along the way I grew to care for you, to respect you. And I learned that the truth is far more valuable than any inheritance." Amber took a deep breath, then pressed one of the red buttons. A collective gasp filled the room. "I pressed this button not to claim the fortune, but to come clean. About my initial intentions, about what I've learned of Blackwood Enterprises' past, about everything. Because that's what real integrity looks like." For a long moment, silence reigned. Then, unexpectedly, Harold began to laugh. It started as a low chuckle and grew into a full-bodied laugh that seemed to shed years from his face. "Oh, Amber," he said, wiping tears of mirth from his eyes. "You've understood the lesson better than I could have hoped." He stood, suddenly seeming more vigorous than he had in weeks. "My dear family, and yes, Amber, I include you in that. This was never about the money. It was about character, about facing the truth, about choosing integrity over personal gain." Harold walked to the table and pressed a hidden button. The screen descended once more, but instead of incriminating footage, it displayed a series of charitable foundations and ethical business initiatives. "The true Blackwood legacy," Harold declared, "is not wealth or power. It's the positive impact we can make on the world. Each of these organizations represents a part of my fortune, dedicated to righting past wrongs and creating a better future." He turned to face them all. The buttons were never connected to the authorities. They were a test of character. And while none of you are perfect, you've all shown the capacity for growth, for change. Over the next hour, Harold laid out his true plan. The Blackwood fortune would be divided among charitable causes, with each family member, including Amber, given the responsibility of overseeing different initiatives. The company would be restructured, with a focus on ethical practices and positive social impact. But what about the past? Robert asked, his voice uncharacteristically subdued. The secrets? The questionable practices? Harold's face grew serious. We'll face them head-on, make amends where we can, accept the consequences where we must. It's time for the Blackwood name to stand for integrity. As dawn broke over the mansion, Amber found herself on the balcony, watching the sunrise with Harold. "You knew, didn't you?" she asked softly. "About my initial intentions?" Harold chuckled. "I had my suspicions, but I also saw the potential for goodness in you, Amber. Sometimes people need to be given the opportunity to rise above their circumstances, to become their best selves." Amber felt tears welling up. "I don't deserve this second chance." Harold took her hand gently. "My dear, that's precisely why you do deserve it. You've learned, you've grown. And now, you have the chance to use that growth to make a real difference in the world." As they stood there, watching the new day dawn, Amber realized that she had found something far more valuable than the fortune she had initially sought. She had found a purpose, a family, and a chance at redemption. The Blackwood legacy was being rewritten, not in dollars and cents, but in acts of integrity and positive change. And Amber, once an outsider with ulterior motives, now stood at the heart of it all, ready to face the future with newfound strength and purpose. As the sun rose higher, casting its warm light over the Blackwood estate, it seemed to Harold not just a new day, but a new era, one of truth, redemption, and the enduring power of second chances. So, if you haven't subscribed yet, click the subscribe button below and join our community. Based on your interests, we've picked this story for you that's showing on your screen right now. Click to watch it now. We're sure you'll love it. See you next time.